So we talked about direct realism and the problem of perception. And just to recall what I said, direct realism is the idea that in perception I am in immediate contact with an object out there that exists independently of my perception. Right? There's nothing between me and the object. And we saw that if you embrace direct realism, then you cannot analyze cases like hallucination in the same way that you can analyze real veridical perception. Because when I hallucinate an elephant, I'm definitely not in immediate contact with an elephant out there that exists independently of my perception. Right? That's just not what's going on. And so if I think that because the perception of an elephant and the hallucination of an elephant could be the same from the inside, they can be indistinguishable, they feel the same to me, that therefore I have to analyze them in the same way, if I think that, then I will have to drop direct realism and consider one of its alternatives. Now, probably the most famous of these alternatives is what is called indirect realism. So indirect realism would keep the idea that in perception, right, in normal perception, I am in contact with an object out there that exists independently of my experience, but I'm in contact with it only indirectly. There's something between me and the object. And what is between me and the object is my experience, you could say. Or to use the nomenclature of 17th century philosophy, it is my idea. And maybe we would say something like it's my conscious experience or something like that. It's something in my consciousness. When I see the elephant, okay, there's an elephant out there in reality. But what I'm immediately aware of is not the elephant, but something in my mind, right? A sort of mental picture of the elephant, maybe. That's what I'm immediately aware of. The visual idea of an elephant, the mental picture of an elephant, the sense data that are gray and elephant shaped or whatever. And there are different ways to try to work this out, different stories to tell about what is between me and the object. But it's supposed to be something that is sort of mental, it's in my mind, and it can be the exact same thing in the case of perception and hallucination. Right? When I hallucinate an elephant, I have this exact same sort of mental picture or idea or sense data, but in that case, there's no real elephant causing them, right? And that's the difference between the perception case and the hallucination case. So, according to indirect realism, yes, when one perceives the elephant, which is out there independently of experience, but one experiences this only indirectly, right? Because directly I am aware of this idea, this mental picture, whatever we want to call it. And so if I want to know whether there is an elephant, I will have to go through a step of reasoning, which maybe goes completely automatically and I don't have to think about it, but it is something like a step of reasoning, right? I mean, in certain cases, like when I know that I have just taken like LSD, maybe I shouldn't take that step of reasoning, right? I shouldn't believe that there's an elephant. In normal cases, I can believe that there's an elephant, right? But it's not like I'm immediately aware of that. It's an extra commitment, an extra step of reasoning that goes beyond the experience itself. Okay, now this story, I think it may be still popular, but it was extremely popular starting at least from the 17th century. Right? This is basically the story of Descartes, and it's basically the story of Locke, and it's especially, I think, the name of Locke that gets associated with it. Right? This idea that we have these ideas and then there's the object. And one of the reasons that Locke's name gets associated with it is that Locke puts a lot of emphasis on the distinction that he makes between what he calls primary and secondary qualities. Although actually this is also something you can already find in Descartes. And the idea of primary and secondary qualities lends some strength and plausibility, you could say, and theoretical importance to indirect realism. Because the idea of primary and secondary qualities is really the idea of, on the one hand, qualities or properties that both my conscious experience and the object in the real world has. And on the other hand, properties that my conscious experience has and which get caused by the object in the world, but which the object in the world itself does not have. Now, I can make this much more concrete by simply giving you an example. Here's how Locke thinks about it. For Locke, the primary qualities are primarily those have to do with size and shape. So if I look at this elephant, right, suppose that there's a real elephant, then my experience is maybe elephant shaped, but so is the elephant, right? The elephant has a particular shape, and in many ways it's the same shape as my experience. So that's both in my mind and in reality. Shape, size, things like that. On the other hand, Locke thinks that color, right, the grayness of the elephant, that is in my mind, and it's not really in the elephant, right? The world outside doesn't really have colors. Colors are something in our mind. They have something to do with how we perceive things. And the objects in the world, like the elephant, cause certain perceptions, and they cause them in systematic ways. And an elephant will always look grey to me, and it's going to look grey to you too, and there's nothing arbitrary about it. But like the greyness, that has something to do with us, with how we perceive maybe certain patterns of light, or certain patterns of particles on the surface of the object, or something like that. And so Locke thinks that like these extremely physical qualities that have to do with size and motion and shape, those are the primary qualities. They are in our experience, and they're also in the world, right? The elephant is really big, it really has a certain size and shape, it really moves, but it's not really grey. And it doesn't really have this, I have no idea how elephant tastes, but it doesn't really have this taste that we might have. It doesn't really sort of smell the way that elephants smell. Not that it's an illusion, the smell and the taste and so on, but how it smells and tastes and what it looks like in terms of color, that has something to do with our ways of perception. It's not just in the object. It has something to do with our ways of perception. These are peculiar features of our sensory apparatus. So the primary qualities are really there in the world. The secondary qualities are sort of causal effects that the primary qualities of the objects have on us because of the way that we perceive the world. And we can see how this distinction between primary and secondary qualities actually fits this indirect realism very well. Right? If I'm an indirect realist, then it makes sense to say that the object is really big and fast and stuff like that, but it's less real that it's grey and smells faintly funky. That is sort of how things are perceived by me, right? That is primarily something in my mind, and only sort of as a causal relation something that I can describe to the object. So the primary qualities are in my mind and in the object. The secondary qualities are really only in my mind, although they are caused by the object in a systematic way. So this is the theory that we find in Descartes, that we find in Locke. It's very popular, but it comes with some problems. And I think there are two problems that are especially important. The first problem is the problem of external world skepticism. Right? If this is your picture of perception, like what we are immediately aware of are our ideas, and then we need a step of reasoning to come to a belief about the external world that is independently of our minds. Well, what actually allows us, justifies us to take that step? Right? Couldn't it be the case that there is no external world at all, and we only have these ideas in our mind? Right? This is a question that may seem very far-fetched if you are a direct realist, but it seems a lot more philosophically important and pertinent when you are an indirect realist, and it's your own theory of perception which generates this question of, hey, how do we do this reasoning, right? How do we know, like, when are we justified in believing that there's really an elephant and it's not just an hallucination, right? And so if you're an indirect realist, the problem of external world skepticism becomes a lot more pressing, so to speak. So there's a problem of skepticism, or to say it in another way, there's a problem of bridging this gap between what is in my mind and the world out there. And we need to be told a story about that, that shows us that we really are in touch with the world out there, even if only indirectly. The second question is what we could call the problem of this primary-secondary quality distinction, or maybe just the problem of primary qualities. And here the question is, well, how do we know which are the primary qualities? Right? And Descartes thinks that he can sort of see that through a rational analysis of matter. And Locke thinks he can explain it by pointing out that things like size and shape can be experienced with more than one sense. Right? You can both see it and feel it, for instance, with your hands. But we might worry that, you know, it seems a pretty big claim that if some of the things that we perceive, like smell and color, aren't really there in the objects, it seems a pretty big claim to say that we know that things like size and shape and speed are really in the object. And so the next thinker I want to look at is a thinker who really presses that objection. And it's George Berkeley, who is known for his idealism, which is another way of thinking about perception. So Berkeley thinks that this primary and secondary quality distinction just doesn't make any sense. Right? He thinks that the primary qualities are just as mind dependent as the secondary qualities. And so one of his examples is this. He says, okay, so according to somebody like Locke, if I have a white square, right? A white square in my mind, the whiteness is mind dependent, and the squareness, that's sort of really in the world out there. But then Berkeley says, well, suppose that you take away the whiteness. Well, what is left? Well, not a square, right? Nothing is left. I mean, there's no size without color, according to Berkeley. And so that might be one reason to think that maybe it's not so easy to draw this distinction. Or you could just maybe give a very general epistemological argument where you say, well, how could we possibly know that, you know, this or that of the qualities we have in our minds is really mind independent and it's also in the objects themselves, whereas the other qualities are not. Or you could even try to give an ontological argument here and say, look, I mean, mind is so completely different from these supposedly mind-independent objects. How could they share properties? Right? How could they even share a property like squareness? Aren't they like two ontologically completely different things? Right? It doesn't even really make sense to think of maybe, let's say, a number and a material object to share properties. I mean, numbers can't be green and material objects can't be even or odd. But maybe the distinction between mind and matter is just as much of an ontological gap. And so it becomes really unclear how something like squareness could apply both to ideas in the mind and objects in reality. And I don't think that's a bad argument. Personally, I think it's a reason to be a direct realist, and not to say that my ideas are square, but to say that the objects are square. But okay, I mean, we are now looking at people who reject direct realism. And if you reject direct realism, then this is not such a bad argument. And, you know, it starts to look as if whatever properties something in the mind might have, so whatever properties our experience might have, like not just color, but also squareness, couldn't possibly at the same time be properties of material objects. Okay, so what is Berkeley's story? Well, famously or infamously, Berkeley embraces a strong form of idealism. And basically he tells us that there are no mind-independent objects and that everything is mental. To be, Berkeley writes somewhere, is to be perceived. Right? To be is to be perceived. And I think we should add, in order to make this a little bit more consistent, that to be is to be perceived or to perceive. Right? I mean, we who perceive also exist. Right? We also are. So there are perceivers and there are things that get perceived. Right? There are, that is, things that are directly perceived. And so those are not the mind-independent objects, but they are mind-dependent objects. Right? Because we have drop direct realism. We're now thinking about ideas in the mind. And then Berkeley takes away the indirect realism part, right? There's nothing there outside the mind. And what we perceive is what there is, except that it's now no longer something that's independent of the mind. It's in the mind. It's not completely uncontroversial that this is Berkeley's theory, but I'm going to give this story as if this is Berkeley's theory. It's certainly how he has been usually understood. Now, of course, this might seem like an extreme position, which generates certain questions, certain problems. And one problem is, okay, but what about things that are not perceived? Right? I mean, okay, here's the Nietzsche bust. I perceive this Nietzsche bust. Maybe you perceive the Nietzsche bust as well, though less directly than I do. Now I look the other way. Did the Nietzsche bust stop existing? It's kind of weird to say that it does, right? To say that it does stop existing. But that does seem to be a sort of immediate consequence of Berkeley's idealism. Now, one way to solve that, and Berkeley certainly indicates in certain passages that that might be how he wants to solve it, is to say, well, you know, the Nietzsche bust is always being perceived by God. But, okay, that becomes a pretty maybe less plausible theory of perception, right? If we need to introduce a divine being who is perceiving everything all the time in order to make our ontology work. So that's one kind of problem. Another kind of problem is, well, actually, a new problem about illusions and hallucinations. Right? Because if to be is to be perceived, then now it becomes problematic to say that there's something wrong with illusions and hallucinations. Right? If to be is to be perceived, then if I hallucinate an elephant, it seems like there just is an elephant. And of course, if you're an idealist, you can try to say something like, yeah, well, but that elephant doesn't really, like the hallucinated elephant doesn't really have the same kind of causal relations to the other objects that we perceive, so maybe we can dismiss it anyway. But that seems to be a little bit tacked on. I mean, if to be is to be perceived, then why not just say that it's a real elephant? Right? And that would mean that we have to really revise our story about illusion and hallucination in a rather radical way. And maybe we should do that, but it's a cost of the theory, we could say. Do we need to go as far as Berkeley's idealism if we accept his argument against primary qualities or against the primary-secondary quality distinction? Well, the last thinker I want to talk about in this video is Mary Shepard, who lives in the early 19th century. Well, she also lives in the late 18th century, but she writes her philosophical works in the early 19th century. And Shepard is interesting in that she is on the one hand a realist, but she's a realist who completely agrees with Berkeley's claim that you can't make a distinction between primary and secondary qualities. And so she unapologetically embraces the idea that not only things like whiteness and sweetness are sort of only in the mind and only qualities of our ideas, but also things like being big or being square or being fast, all these traditional primary qualities, they're only qualities of the ideas in our mind. Okay, well, how can we still be realists? Okay, so Shepard's story has two very important components here. The first is what I think we would now call an appeal to inference to the best explanation. So she's going to say that we have very good reasons to believe that there are objects outside of our experiences that cause those experiences. Why? Well, it's precisely because even when we're not experiencing things, they keep behaving in the same causal ways that they do when we are experiencing them. So, for instance, the Nietzsche bust. I look at it, it's over there. I look away, I look back, it's still over there in the same place. Right? I mean, why? If it had disappeared when I wasn't looking, there's no reason to assume that it's going to still be there when I look again, but it is still there, right? So that's one one thing that is much more easily explained if we believe that these objects exist independently of my perceiving them. And Shepard points out that an even stronger reason maybe to believe that is that these objects, when we're not looking at them, are still having causal relations with each other. Right? So suppose that I put a piece of paper in the fire. It slowly turns into ash. I walk away. I come back 5 minutes later. Now the entire piece of paper is ashes. Right? Apparently the fire and the paper kept interacting with each other when I wasn't looking. Well, that's how things always go in the world. Right? Things keep going the way they are when we're not looking, and then when we start looking again, hey, okay, it turns out that they've been behaving exactly as if they have an independent existence. Well, the best explanation for that, Shepard says, is that they have an independent existence. So we have plenty of reason to believe that. But, as we have seen, Shepard agrees with Berkeley that none of the properties, like not even squareness, bigness, velocity, and so on, that we can find in the perceptual ideas in our mind, can be ascribed to the objects themselves. Right? So our perception is extremely indirect. And so we have to wonder, well, what can we know about those objects? Right? Can we only know that they exist? Well, no, says Shepard. Just as it is causal reasoning that shows us that these objects exist, causal reasoning allows us to know certain things about those objects. So, first of all, take here this principle. The same cause always has the same effects. That means that different effects have different causes. So, well, that means that if I have two different perceptions, I know that there are different objects, right? Objects with different qualities out there in the world causing these two different perceptions. I don't know what those qualities are, but I do know that they are different, right? So that's one thing I know. Kind of minimal, but it's something I know. Well, actually, I know a lot more, Shepard might say. So, for instance, even though I don't know what the real property of objects is that causes them to look big to me in my mind, I do know that whatever this property is, an elephant has more of it than a mosquito. Right? Because an elephant causes bigness a lot more than the mosquito causes it in me. So I can actually sort of say something about quantitative relations between these properties. And I can say something about the causal relations between these properties, right? Between these things even. I may not know what fire really is independently of experience, or what paper really is, or what ash really is, but I certainly do know that there's a causal relation between whatever fire really is and whatever paper really is that causes whatever ash really is. So in multiple ways I can get information about the causal structure of reality. And so what we could say is that Shepard is some kind of structural realist or formal realist, claiming that what we can know from perception is the formal causal structure of reality, even if we can't know any of its, like, what the qualities really are. So if you want to be an indirect realist, right, and you're impressed by the kind of arguments that Berkeley gives, then this might be a good route to take, and one that I think historically definitely did not get the attention that it deserves. So, we've looked at indirect realism of the Descartes-Locke type, we've looked at Berkeley's idealism, and we've looked at Mary Shepard's, what I would like to call maybe formal realism, but it's a kind of indirect realism too, right? But it's an indirect realism which is very uncompromising about what properties of our experience can be ascribed to the real objects out there. One position that I didn't really talk about is Kant's transcendental idealism, even though I'm very interested in that. I'm so interested in it that I want to spend an entire video on it, because it's very easy to misunderstand what Kant is doing, and I want to take away those misunderstandings and give you the truth. So that is the object of the next video. For now, I just want to remind you that I think that direct realism is also absolutely a live option. Right? You do not need to follow the 17th, 18th, 19th century thinkers into dismissing direct realism sort of more or less out of hand. And I think maybe looking at Kant's transcendental idealism will give us one way of seeing why that might be true.